Let's take a look at the Visual Studio environment, the tooling that surrounds Silverlight applications. So in Visual Studio, when we're making file new project, we've got the choice of a Silverlight application or a Silverlight class library. Now naturally a class library, just like it is in regular .NET, is just a bunch of reusable functionality. You might choose to build user controls or various different libraries in there, and then you would use them and reference them from a Silverlight application. So let's just begin one here called environment. And as we said before, when you're creating a project in Visual Studio for Silverlight, by default the sort of UI here wants to help you by creating either a website where you can host your Silverlight application or just a static piece of HTML to host your Silverlight application. Generally speaking, I would go ahead and select a website. Really, there's some things that don't work. If you want to stream a video or something like that, if you do that from HTML in the file system, that won't really work, whereas if you do it from a web project, that will work. You get a choice as to whether you want a website or a web application project. Those are the two different project types in Visual Studio for dealing with web. And then what you get is this little tick box here that says copy to configuration specific folders. What that means is that if your Visual Studio project is set up to be debug version or the release version, or you've got some other custom configurations that you've set up, if you tick this box, then when you build, what you will end up with is a Silverlight application copied into a debug folder or a release folder or whatever the configuration is called folder underneath the client bin folder in your website. So by default that doesn't happen, but if you want that to happen, you can tick this box and that will happen. I'm going to leave that unticked and we click OK. So Visual Studio goes away and it creates two different project types. It creates a Silverlight project type and it creates a web project type as I asked it to. Let's close some windows and look at the Solution Explorer. And what we see here is the website. We always get a default.aspx. We don't really need it, so I'll just delete it. We get two different test pages. I talked about these a little bit in our anatomy of a Silverlight application. If you didn't see that video, just as a quick recap, we have an ASPX page. The ASPX page will use the ASP.NET Silverlight control to go ahead and instantiate our application from its ZAP file. And if you're interested in ZAP files, again, that video about the anatomy of a Silverlight application covers that off. We also have an HTML page in case you're not using ASP.NET on your target web server, and in the HTML page we have an object tag that instantiates Silverlight and passes it the source of the application, which is again our ZAP file. So we get those two things. Then one thing that's not immediately obvious is that there are some settings on the property pages over here that relate to Silverlight. Clearly we have our second project, which is the Silverlight application itself, and we note that when we build that project it winds up in client bin over here with the ZAP. Again, if we tick that initial box on the page on the way in, we would have client bin debug and client bin release. But here we just have client bin because we didn't tick that box. So building this application results in it ending up here. Why does that happen? Well, it's because if we look on the property pages over here, you see there's a little tab for Silverlight applications, and the properties of this website say that it is using this Silverlight application. It's not using configuration specific folders, that's the debug and release, and this is the path that's going to be used for the copy when we build. If you wanted to add another Silverlight application to this website, we can go ahead and add one using an existing project or creating a new project, with the standard options as to what language and where to put it and so on. And when you've chosen that, again, you get these same options. Would you like to copy to configuration specific folders again, the debug release thing? Do you want to add a test page for this particular Silverlight application in the web? And do you want to enable Silverlight debugging? And actually, just coming back to that one for a second, it's important to realize that when you look at your start options for this website, not only do you see ASP.NET as a debugger, you also see Silverlight as a debugger. So important to realize that Silverlight debugging has been switched on for you by default, that you can debug a Silverlight application without doing any extra configuration settings. So as we move across to the Silverlight project over here, I guess the main thing to be aware of is that when you open up a UI piece of Silverlight like this one here, you get the graphical designer inside of Visual Studio. You have a toolbox over here of controls, And obviously your natural inclination is to take a control like this button and try and drag it onto this design surface. However, this design surface is read-only in Beta 2, so you can't do that. You can't graphically build a Silverlight application over here. Naturally, you can move over to Expression Blend and do it there. One thing you can do, which is perhaps not so obvious, is that you can take these things and drag them into the XAML. So if you want to know how to create a button, you can drag it into the XAML. And that the UI editor up here does redisplay the XAML that you're actually editing. So we get full IntelliSense in the XAML. So if we want to set the content to be click here, something like that, the font size to be something like 24, and set the margin to be 10 or something like that. All that stuff works in terms of being able to type it with IntelliSense, so it becomes a great XAML editor. But the toolbox and drag and drop and being able to design this form up here is not something that you can do in the current beta of the tools. And you may like to repartition this so you just get your design on one screen and your XAML on the other screen, and then a quick press of F7 leads you into the code behind that, and so you can nicely move through the environment. Once again, and you might notice as you're moving around this XAML that the UI is following you here. So you've got this little breadcrumb that's following you around. And if you select that button, for instance, again, looking at the properties window, this properties window is not yet working for these controls, so you'd have to manually go in and set the properties that you can set here using IntelliSense. Or once again, use Expression Blend for that kind of stuff. So there's some tooling there in terms of being able to see the designer is very, very useful. But we're not fully there in terms of being able to completely work in Visual Studio just using the toolbox and drag and drop and point and click and all those things you might expect. One last thing to say is that as you are building Silverlight applications, if you're doing things like embedding bitmaps or embedding XAML files, that there are specific build actions that you might want to be aware of. And so, of course, Visual Studio gets this right. But there are other build actions you can take for things like images and so on, as to whether you want them to be content, and we'll talk about locating resources in a different video, or whether you want them to be resources, and so on and so forth. So there are some additional build options just to be aware of that are lurking up here on a per content type basis for your project, the bits that are part of your solution. So hopefully get a flavour as to what Visual Studio is doing around a Silverlight application and where to set up properties and so on to get you building and debugging pretty quickly.